Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to our class on gender and sexual development. Now, as was warned in the previous class, this is usually one of the more dicey topics that we cover throughout the semester, simply because there's obviously some political controversy about some of the topics we're going to be discussing later, and it oftentimes makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about these things. But since this is such an important topic in socio-emotional development, and it's something that affects us all, regardless of whether or not you kind of fit the mainstream concepts of gender and sexual identity, we do want to talk about it in a lifespan development class. So if you can, even though you might have specific biases for or against some of the topics that we're going to be discussing, make sure that you try to keep an open mind so you can understand at least the psychological components that we apply to this particular topic of gender and sexual development. Now, to introduce you to the idea of gender and sexual development, what I thought we'd do today was start off with another little activity. And this activity is going to give you a sense of some of the concepts and terms that people who study this particular topic find so unbelievably important. And to do this, what I want you to do is kind of leave your, I guess, feelings about whether or not this is appropriate at home, and instead just try to do a very simple sorting task. So what I want you to do is take the words listed below and try to categorize them as male, or you could call it boy, and female or girl activities, or I guess ideas. Now, you can strongly disagree with whether or not they should be categorized in one group or the other, but what I want you to do is just go based off of stereotypes, based off just knee-jerk reactions. I want you to take each of these listed words and sort them in boy or girl category. And if you're done doing that, you can advance to the very next slide and we'll discuss why that particular activity really applies to some of the things that developmental psychologists looking at this idea of gender and sexual identity are interested in. Alright, so again, I'm not necessarily saying that those sortings that you might have done there in that last activity were 100% universal across all individuals. I'm not saying that it's right to be able to do those types of things, but what I am saying, which relates very closely to this topic, is that I'm guessing that most of you probably had a fairly easy time at least going off of the stereotypes that you know based on men and women. And this idea of being able to sort terms, sort concepts into different categories relates to a big topic within the idea of social emotional development that we call gender. How we characterize somebody as being male or female. And in particular, it deals with two concepts within this idea of gender called gender roles and gender typing. Gender roles deal with kind of emotional, behavioral, I guess, situational expectations that we place on somebody based on their role. And gender typing deals with ideas, concepts like, pink goes for girls, that we linked to gender. So pink girls is a great example of gender typing. Now, in addition to that, though, when we're talking about this idea of gender, we have another thing that pops up in the developmental phase that we call gender identity. And when people study this idea of gender, they usually study it under the guise of all three of these different areas. Are we looking at how you identify yourself in a specific gender, learning about different types of roles that we associate with genders, or following those rules, things that we type with specific genders when we kind of come to conclude these things, or they can change over the lifespan. This is what we look at in the field of developmental psychology when discussing the topic of gender. And even though obviously there's room to discuss whether or not these types of sortings, these types of learnings are appropriate, many developmental psychologists try to steer clear of that. They don't necessarily talk about what's right and wrong, why one culture prefers one gender norm or one gender type over another, and instead they just focus on what in the biological or social world or even cognitive world kind of pushes or propels people to develop these types of gender roles or gender typing or gender identities that form in most individuals across a large variety of different cultures that are out there. Now, what's really interesting to developmental psychologists is the fact that gender is something that we typically think of as being very adult related. you have adult males and adult females, and this is something that we usually care about much more when we look at kind of the differences that we see in communication or academic performance or success in jobs or family orientations and all these other things that kind of revolve around this concept of gender that we tend to care a lot about when we get into adulthood. But what's really surprising to a lot of developmental psychologists is that children are not immune to the idea of gender. And in fact, by the age of 2, many children already start operating on this kind of dichotomous relationship between, I guess not dichotomous relationship, this dichotomous outcome of gender. You're either a male or you're a female. I guess in their case, it's usually you're a boy or you're a girl. And they start, usually once they recognize the different types of genders that are out there, they start looking for things like gender roles or things that you associate with specific genders. And many children start to become very rigid in their perspectives of gender at a very young age. Now, their understanding of gender is not entirely set. We're going to talk about that in a little while when we get to some of the more kind of unusual effects that we see with gender. But what we recognize at the age of 2, which is really surprising, is that children are not oblivious to gender. They already have the ability to do that categorization task that we talked about earlier, and much more with respect to this idea of gender. And this leads one to ask the question, how? What causes this classification of gender to happen at such a young age in most of us? Now, when we look at young children, what we realize is that a lot of the gender differences probably can't be biological. We'll talk about the biological factors in a little while. But what many people assume is that those early recognition of gender roles and gender identity has a lot to do with the social environment, the social world that kids find themselves in. And we see, as developmental researchers, a lot of different avenues where kids start picking up on these differences between genders. One of the big areas that most researchers believe plays a prominent role in gender diversification amongst kids is in their interactions with their parents. Some parents knowingly try to teach and coach their children in gender appropriate behaviors. They'll coach females to act more ladylike, or they'll have them wear specific types of colors or act specific ways amongst individuals that really kind of eschews them into this new gender role that they think is very important for these children to learn. Other parents might more subtly do these types of things. So they might kind of, for boys, ask them to be a little bit more tough, or demand more physical exertion from their boys, or be more tolerant of specific types of behaviors for one gender versus another. And by doing these types of things, by kind of reacting to their children in accordance to the gender that they are, they can unknowingly kind of persuade a child to start attending to those gender differences, and very likely can start to kind of put them on the path to associating themselves with a specific gender and specific rules and types that are familiar with those genders, or commonly associated with those genders. Now, we also see, though, that while parents are interacting with their children, they're inundated in their cultures, in their environments, with other types of norms, other types of kind of standards for how you should behave, how you should act based on your gender. If you've ever watched a Disney movie in your life, you've probably realized very quickly how inundated children can be with these gender appropriate behaviors and gender requirements. Now, I understand that Disney and Pixar and some of the more kind of, I guess, new types of movie producers are trying to create more gender neutral characters in the last couple decades, but nonetheless, even with those pushes, it still is very clear that if you look around our culture and our environment, children, even before they're capable of truly understanding what gender is all about, are inundated with information about how men and women are different. And what makes this even more prominent is when children start actually getting into school. What we see very often is that kids, once they get into school, based on the kind of way they've been treated by their parents, based on what they've been taught in terms of how to act, how to interact with each other, tend to get pushed into groups of individuals that are the same sex as them. We're not sure if this is intentional based on the fact that you've got girls hanging out with girls because they're girls, or girls hanging out with girls because they have the same type of social interactions, or they've started to learn to kind of gravitate towards specific types of things, and same thing for boys, or whether, or this is something that's biologically predisposition, but we see this same sex socialization really causing young children to not only kind of recognize gender differences, but really gravitate towards these gender differences. Obviously, there's always exceptions. You've got your tomboys, you've got boys that act very feminine, and you've got these kind of interactions that sometimes don't necessarily hit the norm. Boys and girls being very good friends despite their gender differences. But for the most part, statistically, we see elementary school and kind of the early years of education as playing a major role in those development of gender norms and gender standards that these kids tend to follow. One of the things that really starts to pop up within these children's understanding as they get into school and they start to learn from their environment and their peers is this notion of gender schemas. Now, remember back to Piaget, we talked about the idea of schemas as rules of how things work. Well, there's a belief that when children get into these years of kind of early adolescence, they start to really form schemas as to what each gender is all about. And there's a belief also at about age 5 that not only do kids start to form schemas about the differences between men and women, but they also start to realize cognitively that gender is a very static thing. It can't change with time. Much research has gone in to show that many kids, even though they can recognize differences between boys and girls and can recognize at a young age if they're a boy or girl, don't realize until they're about age 4 or 5, sometimes even 6 or 7, that not only are they, say, a boy today, but they're going to be a boy tomorrow, and a boy next week, and a boy for the rest of their life. And it's not until they really perfect their schemas of gender and truly understand that this understanding really takes hold and really pushes them to kind of grab on or grasp onto those gender roles or those gender standards that they've learned before they've even realized that they have to be that one gender throughout their entire life. Now, what also murkies the water when we talk about this idea of gender is the fact that we know there are biological influences, especially at later ages, that do kind of exacerbate the push of men performing more masculine things and females performing more feminine things or following more feminine roles when we get into adulthood. And the major biological trigger that many people have studied, you probably have heard of them before, is called hormones. Hormones are chemicals that are actually released by a number of different organs within our body, but the ones that we're most careful to study, or I guess attentive to when we talk about gender, are the hormones of estrogens and androgens. And they're actually a series of hormones that are produced through a number of different events that start in our pituitary gland and our hypothalamus. Usually it's at about the age of, it's actually at the age of puberty, where these hormones, what we call tropic hormones, are produced by the pituitary gland and hypothalamus and sent down to what are called our sex organs or our gonads. For men, it's their testes. For females, it's the ovaries. And once those messages, those tropic hormones, are sent to those areas, you get this flooding in the internal system of estrogens and androgens. Now, both males and females produce significantly more estrogens and androgens when they undergo puberty, but the ratios are vastly different from men and women. So women produce much more estrogen after they start their puberty, and a little bit more androgens when they start puberty. And males produce significantly more, actually way more androgens once they start puberty, and a decent amount more of estrogens when they begin puberty. And we know that these particular productions of these hormones kick in very pronounced physiological changes. Females start developing primary and secondary sex characteristics. They begin their menstrual cycles thanks to the increase in estrogens. Males also develop their primary and secondary sex characteristics, as well as start to have kind of visible changes in things like their height and other things that kind of relate to these androgens. But what's really interesting is we think that these kind of instances where these hormones are kicking in might also trigger some cognitive changes within men and women. Now, there's lots of questions as to how much they affect them. There's a belief that some of it might be not even related to the kind of the impact of these things on the mind as much as the physiological changes that they see kind of changing their thinking. But there's a lot of research going into how hormones might exacerbate kind of the differentiation that we see between kids already starting to emerge before they reach puberty. And what we do have is a lot of research to show that if these hormones aren't produced in the correct way, if there's kind of exceptions to the norm, you can see some very pronounced deviations in gender roles. What we've seen in a lot of studies is that testosterone, the thing that we link to males, testosterone is a type of androgen, the one that's most commonly recognized. Once testosterone is produced too much in males, you get a great amount of aggression. Now, not all males have an exact correlation of the amount of testosterone they produce and the amount of aggressiveness they display. But when you see extreme cases of aggression, there's been studies that have shown that extremely aggressive fraternity brothers, in a specific study looking at fraternity brothers across a specific campus, there's even studies that have shown that highly aggressive criminals all produce excessively large amounts of testosterone. So we link this idea of androgen production with what we usually think of as male-specific behavior. But we also have seen, which was really interesting, is that when people have some type of an abnormality in their kind of body's chemistry or the way their body reacts to androgens or estrogens, you can see a profound effect on the gender identity and some of the gender appropriate behaviors that these people display. There's something called androgen insensitive males, which is a group of individuals who, for some reason, their body doesn't respond to the androgens the way most males' bodies respond to them. It's as if they're not producing more androgen when they go into puberty, so they don't really undergo the physiological change that we would expect with males. And in fact, usually they look kind of unambiguous to which gender they actually are because their body's not responding to this androgen, even though if we look at their chromosomes, their biological structure, they are indeed male. And what we see with many of these males is this lack of responsivity to androgen often causes some confusion about gender identity, about sexual orientation, about even which gender norms they feel they should abide by. And this has also worked for females as well. There's a group of individuals who experience something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. These females, just like their kind of counterparts, the androgen sensitive males, tend to identify themselves because of this extra amount of androgens that they're producing as more male-like. They possess many of the male physical characteristics, and they usually, not always, but usually associate with males and sometimes even take on the gender identity of being male. And these exceptions to the norm, when the body isn't working correctly, really add a layer of depth to this story about where gender differences are actually coming from, how these separations happen when we look at the biological level of these differences.